Okay, so before I start this off, I wanted to give you a little bit of a notice. This video is going to be a little bit different than my typical build videos in like Skyrim, for example. I don't really feel comfortable telling you exactly what to do in Mass Effect, since, especially the first game, since you build up your character more incrementally, and there's various different weapons and armor, and for the most part, I think that anyone that's played it knows really just go for the highest stat armor and highest stat weapons. And because your skills and your talents grow so progressively over time, you can't just say like, hey, put like 7 points into this and 8 points into that so specifically. There might be a little bit of that, but not that much. Not as much as some of my other stuff that you're seeing. So this video is going to be more of like a discussion-based video, where I tell you like the different strategies and combinations that I did that helped me get through the game. And hopefully you guys like it. I'm not sure. I've never done anything like this one before, but we'll see how it works out in the end. So with that said, guess we'll get into it. As you probably already know, Sentinels are probably the most versatile class in Mass Effect. They combine the best traits from both biotic and tech skills, but they tend to be lacking in two major categories, particularly in the first game. Their damage resistance and their combat damage. So pretty much they're not good at taking damage, at least not like, health damage anyway. And they're not good at really killing things with guns. They only start off with a pistol. There are ways to mitigate this, however. For example, they have both electronics and barrier, which will kind of help you out in a fight, especially when on Insanity there are issues with that. Well, the Geth tend to be able to just shoot right through your shields. But sadly, there's no easy way of actually helping out the damage protection aspect of the Sentinel. But you can help out with the combat skills, and that's where we're going to go with next. So pretty much any of the bonus combat abilities would be good for them, would be good for a Sentinel. Assault rifles, shotguns, even sniper rifles, they would all work out pretty well. But I think what's best for an Insanity playthrough would probably be the assault rifles. I can make this argument about pretty much every class you pick, but for the Sentinel in particularly, I think that assault rifles are best. Shotguns tend to be great at close range, but just getting over to your target on Insanity when you don't have that high damage protection, you will probably end up dying before you even make it over to them to shoot them. And sniper rifles just feel a little bit odd for the Sentinel. I'm not really a big fan of sniping in the first Mass Effect game. It would work, just it's not my particular preference to snipe people. So we'll save that for a different class. But I personally think that assault rifles is probably the best skill to take, allowing you to fight enemies at mid to long range, even short range at times, though it's probably not best. But it also pairs well with a lot of the abilities, such as Lift and Stasis, which will essentially allow you to stop enemies in their tracks and shoot them until they die. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So before I talk about specific powers and talents that you're going to want to invest in, let's talk about the specializations available to the Sentinel. You have both the Bastion specialization and the Medic specialization. And for anyone familiar with Mass Effect, you're probably just going to want to go for Bastion. With the Bastion specialization, you will gain an enhanced version of your barrier, which will increase both your shield strength and the duration of the ability. It will also allow you to regenerate 40 shields per second. Very useful, especially since you don't really have too much damage protection as a Sentinel. The shields that you gain will help you at least in fights against things like, say, mercs. It's not the most effective against Geth because Geth on Insanity can basically shoot right through your shields, bypass your shields entirely. But against things like mercs or other enemies of that sort, it can help you and keep you alive during a fight. It's still best to stay back and let a more combat-approved squad mate deal with enemies close and personal, but useful enough. In the second part, the second specialization is probably the most important. Stasis. When you become a Bastion, the improved version of Stasis offers the ability to actually damage enemies trapped in Stasis. Stasis without this aspect is virtually useless, being that enemies are just as protected from you as you are now from them. When they're frozen, you can't shoot them. You can't damage them anyway. But when you're a Bastion and have fully maxed out your specialization at the end, they are now susceptible to damage. You can shoot them while they're completely frozen. However, your squad mates, for whatever reason, didn't get the memo. They might not shoot them at all. Sometimes they will if they, were like trying to kill them initially before you triggered stasis, but other times they'll kind of just ignore them, even if they're the last active enemy in the area. It's probably one of the best combat options available to you. It's just to freeze an enemy in stasis and just unload on them. Now for the powers. Like I said before, I can't tell you specifically how many points to invest into which abilities, or even what abilities to invest in first, but I can give you a better sense about what works with the Sentinel, and at least what I did. For the most part, Lift and Stasis, after becoming a Bastion, of course, are probably the best powers to invest points in. You're going to want to basically max out both of those abilities. Both of those powers basically will stun an enemy and prevent them from being able to attack you while giving you the ability to unload on them. And they're one of the fastest ways that you will be able to kill enemies. You're also going to want to focus on Barrier and Electronics and Decryption. I wouldn't recommend maxing out either of these abilities. You really just need to take them up to the master level. They're decent in combat, but the biotic abilities are what you're going to want to focus on more. Electronics might not even be necessary at all if you, say, take Liara with you, which is what I ended up doing for most of the game, since you're going to want to max out her electronics anyway. And then lastly, Assault Rifles. Assault Rifles, as I mentioned before, is probably the best bonus skill to take, but you also don't really need to max it out. I tended to focus more on Lift, Barrier, and Stasis. I could recommend putting some points into Assault Rifles earlier on in the game, because for most of the game I wasn't doing as much damage as I would have liked. By the time the end game came around and I put a decent amount of points into Assault Rifles, I was doing much more damage. So I'd recommend early on putting 3 or 4, 5 points or so, at least taking Overkill. That's the best setup for you as an individual. And finally, for the squad. Originally, when I started my playthrough, I used Ashley and Rex, because both of them will make up for the lack of combat abilities that you have as a Sentinel, and both of them have a high deal of damage protection, and they can both use immunity. So they're essentially tanks that can take damage for you. However, Ashley isn't quite as useful for that role as I thought she'd be. And about halfway through my playthrough, I ended up switching to Liara. Oddly enough, even though Liara can't tank damage, she does have a great variety of crowd control abilities. She can use Lift, which will, like you, will be able to make enemies more vulnerable to attack. She can use Warp, which will weaken an enemy's damage protection, making them also far more vulnerable to attack. And she has Electronics to make up for her lack of defense. And she can also use Electronics to help you unlock containers or fix hardware. So if you don't want to invest into Electronics and save your points for other things like Assault Rifles, her Electronics will help you with that. Rex is really good with Liara. He also has Warp. As I mentioned before, Rex also has Immunity, which will allow him to take more damage. And he also has Barrier, which he can use to temporarily restore his shields. But with that, he can use Assault Rifles and he can use Shotguns. I ended up mostly focusing on the assault rifle aspect for the endgame fights. Shepard and Liara would lift enemies, while Liara and Rex would warp harder enemies and enemies with high amounts of shields. Warp would lower their damage resistance, allowing Shepard and Rex to use their assault rifles far more effectively. I ended up realizing by endgame that that's probably one of the most effective combinations. Well, I hope that helps. I know this is a bit more of an unconventional build video. I wasn't going on script, I was mostly just more of like a stream of consciousness style to this video. I hope it wasn't confusing. Let me know in the comments if it was, if you like this style, or if you rather how I was going before with in my Skyrim videos, for example. I might switch it up. I don't know. It depends on how the editing process goes. But yeah, just give me all of your comments and feedback, and I'll make adjustments as needed. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. And thank you for watching, and like and subscribe.